thing that no one ever clicks? Thanks. The release of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice brought with it a discussion, or more of a screeching about the nature and accessibility of difficult video games. There are those who say that Japanese Dark Souls is a tough cookie and that if you're not skilled enough or willing to dedicate the time to make meaningful progress, then the game isn't for you, which is true. By its very nature, Sekiro is an experience which demands many things from a player, and dedication is an important one. Then there are those who say that difficult games should have an easy mode for people who lack the time or ability to get good, which can be a valid point depending on the game, but you'd have to be more specific than just easy mode. What needs to change and how will it make the game easier? Does damage need a bump? Do health values need a reduction? Do enemy patterns need reworking? It's easy to pat yourself on the back pushing that vacuous hot air even further, but it's another thing entirely to add value to a conversation. Calls for undefined features are a bit of a monkey's paw, as plenty of developers have added microtransactions to single-player games of late in order to assist those who might be struggling. While this is technically an accessibility feature, I think we can all agree that it's a shit cunt move, and completely belittles the design of any game it's in. There was also mention of how difficulty excludes disabled people, but plenty of things exclude disabled people. Like stairs and being normal. Fuck, that was bad, I should cut that. If any disabled people are watching this, who have had their gaming experiences worsened specifically by a lack of an easy mode, please shoot me a comment. I've genuinely seen people say that if you don't want Sekiro to have difficulty settings, that you don't care about the experiences of disabled people, and let me just say in response to that, why are you like this? Imagine getting mad that you can't beat a video game and then using those with a disability as a front for your inability, while also conflating the term disabled with unable to play video games on the same level as everyone who isn't a journalist. And look, I don't have a social media presence, so I don't have a horse in the point scoring race, and I'm not out to project my shitty opinions for brownie points. See, I'm smart. I do it for ad revenue. The point being that I'm actually pro-accessibility. As a colorblind mongoloid myself, I appreciate when developers include those options. I never use them because I'm a real man, but it's nice that they exist. There are many great ways to add accessibility features without impacting a game at its core. Rebindable controls, individual audio sliders, subtitles, and even some peripherals are a fantastic and non-intrusive way of allowing more people to access your game. If you follow this discussion closely, you might recall a few years back where someone asked the Legend of Grimrock developers if their game would have on-screen inputs. Their reply to this bloke stated that they didn't think anyone used the on-screen interface in older games, so the thought had never occurred to them. This person followed up again with a mention of their disability and that they use one of those mouth controller things for their computer, but they said that they understood and that they're still looking forward to the game. The Grimrock developers, being the absolute units they are, added these on-screen controls just for this one bloke. This is the best kind of accessibility, as it genuinely helps out people who need it without impacting gameplay in any capacity, and now I can play it one-handed, which is pretty cool. If you don't own Legend of Grimrock or have never heard of it, go and fix your mistake. These motherfuckers deserve your money and attention, and it's got a sequel, which is also pretty good. But let's get back on topic. This video, if written well enough, will detail why I think adding difficulty options to Sekiro goes against the idea of niche market appeal, as well as the core mechanics of the game. The inclusion of an easier mode could only be requested by someone who doesn't respect the former and either fundamentally misunderstands the latter or who hasn't played it, which raises questions of intent, but that's a slippery rabbit hole to go down. I think I'll avoid that. So to ask of an intentionally challenging game that it not be so difficult undermines the entire point. You wouldn't ask that a horror game not be spooky, or a shooter not use guns, or that a Bethesda game be playable on launch. I mean, you could, but that's unrealistic. It doesn't make a lot of sense for a game to release with a particular intent and to appeal to a certain market, only for a group outside of that demographic to whinge about how it doesn't cater specifically to them. You can absolutely level criticisms at the quality of the mechanics, art direction, sound, or even how it utilizes and balances difficulty, but a dismissive elitist screeching about an undefined change achieves little outside of your echo chamber. When you break it down to fundamentals, an easier difficulty simply translates to easier progression, but you're not entitled to the entirety of a game by virtue of starting it up, and accessibility doesn't grant you a guided tour. While we're on the subject of accessibility, having easier access to something is vastly different to being able to interact with that thing to the fullest extent. I feel for disabled people, I genuinely do, but accessibility is a poor argument for the inclusion of difficulty settings because the game still operates in the same fashion. Someone who struggles to interface with Sekiro on its standard difficulty would have those same issues with an easier difficulty. It would simply remove the incentive to learn the mechanics by being too forgiving. In a market flooded with AAA sludge, which I would say is overly accommodating and panders to the lowest common denominator, the FromSoft back catalogue is a welcome break from the norm. Why you'd want to bastardize a very clear shift for mainstream tastes and put Sekiro in the same box as Assassin's Creed is beyond me. I like diversity in my style of video game. Now, I've got nothing against Assassin's Creed specifically, but it and games like it practically beg the player to continue playing, as all significant obstacles are dulled to the point where anyone can pass them, and the incentive to do so is dulled as well. Stagnation and complacency are the death of creativity, and the reiterative nature of the AAA market has left it a concentrated wasteland of safe, uninspired design. Creating something in order to appeal to everyone usually leaves said thing without a personality and style of its own, and these victims of the figurative focus group often end up existing as little more than a forgettable experience. That's one of the reasons I love modern FromSoft titles. They're games with bizarre settings and rule sets, and you've got to navigate both, harsh as they may be, in order to get something meaningful out of them. These rule sets are often reliant upon the difficulty or a break from recycled design conventions, and Sekiro is no exception. Difficulty settings in games such as Sekiro are balancing for lazy people. They exist as an oversimplification of what the term difficulty means and how it can be implemented. An effective way to utilize difficulty modifiers should come from within the design of the game. FromSoft titles in the past have done a great job of this. Dark Souls, for example, allows the player to upgrade their stats and equipment, offers a whole host of differing and synergistic playstyles, as well as allowing you to summon a bunch of mates to prolapse a boss or two. Even Zelda is a decent example of a game with no traditional difficulty setting, but one which features a myriad of consumable items, a handful of optional equipment, and multiple ways to deal with enemies. These small features can make the game easier if you need them, without undermining the core mechanics. Sekiro shares a similar design philosophy and features many ways to shift the difficulty. As stealth is a fundamental mechanic and plenty of sub-bosses can be severely damaged by sneak attacks, some of the challenge can be offset by playing to a slower, more careful style. While there's only one major boss I can recall which is susceptible to stealth, there are many other tools at your disposal to deal with these threats. Dispatching mini-bosses grants you prayer beads with which you can obtain health and posture upgrades, gourd seeds increase the amount of times you can heal, there are secondary expendable healing items, as well as items which buff damage, defense, or stealth capabilities. Permanent damage upgrades are rewarded for besting a major boss, and a skill tree accompanies all of this, allowing the player some light customization in their techniques, as well as a few passives. Then there's a bunch of unlockable shinobi tools, each with varying subtypes which all have different effects and usages. The tools at a base level can be used in varying ways, such as the throwing knives being used to stall enemy posture or to stop an attack animation. The fireworks can either be used as a way to stun the enemy for a cheeky attack, or they can be hidden behind in order to make healing safer. That's not to mention the fact that Sekiro has two ways to increase the difficulty, and opting out of these is effectively an unspoken easy mode. The Demon Bell is an optional item/status which can be dispelled at any point. It seems to increase enemy aggro range, but the trade-off is that more currency is gained alongside better drops. Then there's Kuro's Charm, which is an item you can choose to accept at the beginning of the game, which is technically an easy mode. If you choose to relinquish ownership of this charm, foes yield more skill points, but also do chip damage if you guard against an attack. This incentivizes learning proper parry timing against all enemies to avoid rapidly chugging through your healing supply. I've also read that not having the charm increases enemy stats, but as far as I can see, this is unconfirmed speculation. Both of these items make the game easier or harder depending on how you use them, but they're not simply an option you can tick for an all-around easier time. There are valid reasons to both utilize them and avoid them, and as a result there's more of a situational dynamic regarding their use. Mini-bosses also expose the player to a slightly more serious test than that of the experience fodder, and push you to use these abilities and mechanics in order to become comfortable with them. But not too comfortable. Succeeding these mid-sized boys are the massive spectacle boss fights, where quick reaction times, the ability to recognize patterns, and a firm grasp of the aforementioned mechanics come into play, pushing not only the game, but the player as well to their absolute limits for that ever so rewarding victory. It is masterful. It's art. And why would you want to change art? Well, let's explore that. So to imagine what a theoretical easy mode would entail, we have to break down the most challenging points of gameplay and start applying changes to make them more manageable, and less punishing. There are only so many things you could feasibly tweak to allow an easier mode. The way games typically do it is by manipulating health and damage values, slowing the rotation of enemy movesets, feature less movesets, or make the mechanics easier to interact with. And ultimately, none of these would work for Sekiro because of how it's designed. Reducing the amount of enemies makes no sense, as with the ease of movement and stealth mechanics, there are so many safe approaches to dispatching foes or simply ignoring them outright that it would be pointless. Making enemies less aggressive could be an easy mode feature, but I don't think enough maps could implement this in any sort of significant way. If you want less aggressive AI, just utilize the stealth system, or flee until they de-aggro and then use the stealth system. Lowering enemy damage seems like an easy go-to, but it would disincentivize learning the proper timing for blocks and parries as you could tank much more damage. Seeing as these are the fundamentals to the game, you'd also screw yourself in the long run as boss fights are specifically designed around them, so you'd get less practice as a result. Lowering health pools would also not affect anything during standard enemy and mini-boss interaction, as posture kills are the dominant method. You slap an enemy so hard their guard breaks, and then you get one free health bar because they can't hold a sword anymore. For most bosses, posture is the dominant method of dispatch, and lowering these values would render the system pretty much pointless. There's also the method of upgrading your attack endlessly with the help of grinding, so options are there if you're finding healthy enemies a bit tough. Lowering posture fares much the same, as the meter increases by successfully parrying and laying into your enemies. It encourages and rewards good playing and effectively shaves time off boss fights for making few mistakes. These are the only major interactions I could think of changing without restricting content such as bosses and chunks of their combat patterns, so if you have any better ideas, please let me know in the comments. Making Sekiro easier is not a good idea. As I've said, it would either fundamentally undermine the mechanics or be utterly pointless and effectively dumb it down. It'd be like lowering the reading age of a novel because you wanted to be inclusive of 4-year-olds, or spelling out every theme and piece of subtext in a movie because you were scared that people wouldn't get it.
After writing this book, I decided that I wanted monkeys to be able to read it. So, after penning it in English, I published it in French.
I don't know, at what point do you cut your losses and just play any of the million other games that are designed for you? Like a bit of a personal aside, I don't play many horror games because it's not my genre. I can't do tension and the spooks are too much for me, especially those audio ones, I fucking hate that shit. See, it's awful. However, that doesn't negate my interest in the horror genre. I'd love to play it, but I've come to terms with the fact that it's largely not for me because I'm a little bitch. When the first Five Nights at Freddy's dropped, I was super into it. It was a low-budget game that took advantage of its constraints and got into your head, providing an extremely tense but rewarding experience. The series since then has definitely taken a nosedive, but that first game was brilliant, and I would have been digging it if I could get past the fourth night. My refusal to play with sound meant that I couldn't hear critical audio cues, which made that stage impassable. That said, I would never ask that it be any different. I love it for the fact that it doesn't cater to me, because it'd be a worse game for it. It stuck to the original vision, and a lot of other people loved it as a result. Luckily, we live in a day and age where I could simply go onto Markiplier's channel and watch a let's play of the game in its entirety. It's definitely not the same as experiencing it yourself, but I think it's a pretty solid replacement. Because of my inability to play that particular title, I developed a little guilty pleasure of watching Markiplier play all the subsequent releases so I could monitor how the series progressed. Or regressed without getting jump scared in a game for 9-year-old furries. Shout out to my boy Markiplier for doing more damage to my eardrums than Freddy Fazbear ever could. Also, if Darkside Phil can beat Sekiro, anyone can fucking do it. As a closing note, to expect a game to do anything but deliver its core ideas as best it can, and demand that it cater to people outside of that scope is entitled and childish. I was worried that this horror tangent would be completely unrelated, but it's actually quite apt at pinning down the selfish nature of these broken internet husks. Shoutouts to my boy DSP, who cried less than these people. Also, along the same vein, shoutouts to my boy Dreamwhale for being naked in this video. Check out his channel if you're still here. Thanks for watching.